Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started. My name is Deborah Gonzalez, and I am the Government Affairs Director here at the Public Policy Institute of California, or PPIC. Thank you for joining us today. For those of you who are not familiar with PPIC, we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank with offices both in Sacramento and San Francisco. They write San Francisco first, but I switch it because I know we're more important here. For today's program, we'll hear the main findings from a new report titled Reforming Math Pathways at California's Community Colleges, authored by Olga Rodriguez, Han Johnsons, Marisol Cuellar Mejia, and welcome back, and Bonnie Brooks. I think this is Bonnie's first publication, so we're really excited for her. Following the presentation, we'll hear from a great panel of experts on this topic. We'd like to thank the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the College Futures Foundation, and the Sutton Family Fund for their support of this work. You should have received a copy of the report on your chair. There are additional copies in the back of the room. The full report, as well as the slides, are available right now on the PPIC website, ppic.org. We really recommend you look at our website. We redesigned it recently, and even on your handheld, it really looks fantastic. So we hope that you would enjoy that kind of website change. You should have also received an agenda with all the speakers' bios on the back side. If there are any clarifying questions about the report after Olga presents her the report, we'll have a few minutes for questions, but we'll have extra time at the end of the panel. We want to note that we have we're video casting this, so if you have questions, please wait for the microphone to come to you so that our online audience can hear your questions as well. A couple more things before we begin. Later today, you'll receive a survey from us, and you all know you get those. And so please respond to those. They're very helpful for us, and we do look at them and use them to evaluate our processes here. And please turn off and silence your cell phones. California's community colleges is the largest system in this nation. It serves 2.1 million students that come from diverse backgrounds. Many of these students, like myself, are first-generation college students, which bring their own challenges. As previous reports have noted, 80% of these students traditionally get diverted into the developmental system, where for the most part, they may not emerge. Today's report is a good news story about a system beginning to embrace reform. It recognizes the legislature's financial commitment to reform and the Chancellor's office focus on finding programs that work. The report even highlights the fact that the three segments are working together to make sure these new classes are accepted for transfer purposes. In some cases, just yesterday they approved them, but they are working together and it's very exciting. But reform in a system of this size is very complex and not easy. It's a bit like turning a battleship. And while the number of reform classes are still a small subset of the developmental classes being offered, I want to leave you with one last note of the optimism I found in the report. And this is a quote. Because the number of students affected by developmental education is so large, even modest improvements in student success will allow many more thousands of students in California to reach their academic goals, thereby improving their own well-being and that of the state. Just a really nice thought. So thank you guys for doing this report, and thanks to the systems for embarking on this kind of reform. I'd like to now introduce Olga Rodriguez. She is a research fellow at PPIC, where she studies the impacts of programs and policies on student outcome, with particular focus on college access and success among underserved students. Welcome, Olga.
Thanks, Deborah. So thanks again for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be here to report on findings from our new report on reforming math pathways in California's community colleges. And like Deborah said, this is joint work with my colleagues Hans Johnson, Bonnie Brooks, and Marisol Cuellar Mejia. We'd like to definitely acknowledge our funders, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, College Futures Foundation, and the Sutton Family Fund. Also, this research would not be possible if it were not for the access to longitudinal student data provided by the Chancellor's office, as well as the faculty, staff, and administrators who shared their valuable insights to help us better understand what are some factors that are promoting improved student outcomes. So as Deborah said, California Community Colleges is a large and diverse system. They serve almost half of all undergraduates in the state, as well as the majority of Latino and African American students. They also serve many low-income and non-traditional students. As you can see, given the importance of community colleges, unless we're able to remove obstacles for student success, we're not going to be able to achieve the state's meet the state's increasing demand of a college-educated workforce. One of the biggest obstacles that we've identified facing students in community colleges is a large number of students enrolling in developmental education. We find that 64% of students coming into community colleges enroll in a developmental math course. And the lower you start in the sequence, the less likely you are to ever complete a transferable math course. And this is a great cause for concern given the equity implications. More students of historically underrepresented students are more likely to enter the developmental education sequence, and they're also more likely to start at lower levels. So given these concerns, poor outcomes as well as the equity concerns, colleges across the state are moving towards reforming their developmental curriculum as well as the assessment and placement policies intended to place students within the curriculum. So our panel will likely discuss a lot of these new interventions as well. So the report I'm going to be talking about today focuses on two of the most commonly used reforms in developmental math. The statistics pathway, which provides an accelerated pathway to transfer level math for students in liberal arts and humanities majors. It also aims to better align with the transfer level statistics. We also studied compression in the algebra sequence, which aims to accelerate students' progression to transfer level math by combining two levels of developmental math into a single semester. It also aims to reduce the amount of time spent in review as well as reducing redundancy. An important thing to note here is that despite the amount of reform that's happening across the state, reforms are actually only reaching a small share of students. In fact, when we did a scan of all the reforms being used in California community colleges, we found that actually less than 10% of students are enrolling in one of these alternative pathways in math. And in fact, 20% of colleges were not implementing any sort of alternative math pathway for their students. So here we compare the traditional math and statistics pathways. As you can see, the traditional math pathway is comprised of 4 different levels, starting with arithmetic, going all the way through intermediate algebra. So a student would need to spend 4 semesters or up to 2 years to complete the math sequence if they begin in the lowest level. Historically, California community colleges have required students to demonstrate proficiency in intermediate algebra in order to access transfer level math, including pre-calculus and statistics. As you can see, compared to the statistics pathway, acceleration happens by reducing the amount of developmental courses the student needs to take. It reduces at 7 colleges, the 4-level sequence is reduced to 1, because students only need to complete the developmental pre-statistics course prior to accessing transfer level math, including statistics and quantitative reasoning. The majority of colleges, however, have prerequisites in order to access the statistics pathway. At these colleges, students complete up to 2 developmental courses prior to accessing transfer level math. This still reduces the developmental education sequence by half, going from 4 levels to 2. And then the other thing to note here is that statistics pathways across California were developed in a variety of ways. The majority of the colleges in our study implemented statistics pathways that were designed by the California Acceleration Project. Another group of colleges implemented statistics pathways through the Carnegie Foundation Statway program, and other colleges went at it alone by developing their own curriculum and professional development activities. Here we move on to our first set of findings. Here we see that overall we find very promising outcomes. The number of students, out of 100 students who started in a statistics pathway, 75 completed their statistics developmental education coursework. 67 subsequently enrolled in a transfer level math course, and 49 completed the transfer level math course. This compares to only 16 of their peers who started in the traditional math sequence. When we also looked at the number of transferable credits, and students in statistics pathway also outperformed their peers in the algebra pathway, the traditional math pathway. And we also see that this impact carries on over to degree completion and transfer. Within 3 years, we see that students who started in the statistics pathway complete at double the rate of those that started in the algebra pathway, 13 compared to 26% of them. We also looked at the equity associated with these different outcomes. As you see from this figure, this shows the proportion of students completing the transfer level math course by whether the student started in the traditional math pathway compared to the statistics pathway. We see that across the board, all groups of students benefited from participating in the statistics pathway. African American, Latino, low-income students, more than almost tripled the proportion in which completed the transfer level math course. However, if we look at the gaps, they persist. And in fact, in some cases, they've gotten a little wider. So moving on to our findings for the compression of traditional math. The traditional pathway, as described previously, is comprised of 4 levels. Compression, on the other hand, combines 2 levels of developmental math into one. We found that colleges often compress either at the top level, meaning they compress elementary and intermediate algebra, or at the lower level, meaning they compress arithmetic and pre-algebra. The majority of colleges in the state are actually only compressing at the lower levels. For this group of colleges, the sequence is reduced from 4 levels to 3 levels. 17 colleges are only compressing at the top level, and for them, the same. If the student enters at the lowest sequence, they must still go through a series of 3 courses. 5 colleges at the state, we found, are actually compressing the full sequence, and at this set of institutions, compression reduces the amount of time students spend in developmental education by half, from 4 levels to 2. So here we also find promising outcomes for students participating in compressed algebra. Out of 100 students who started in a compressed algebra pathway, 66 completed the developmental education sequence, 43 go on to enroll in the transfer level math course, and 28 go on to complete the transfer level math course. This compares to only 15 of their peers in the traditional math pathway. However, we also found that compressed algebra students also earn more transfer credits. However, we do not see differences in terms of their degree completion or transfer. Despite having nearly double the rate of completion of transfer math, we do not see these outcomes persist for completion or transfer. However, I also need to mention we only tracked student outcomes for 3 years, so perhaps this group of students requires more time to complete those outcomes. So I guess this is a good point to just bring it back to statistics, where we did observe a significant impact in this transfer and completion. When we look at the equity implications of compressed algebra for students, we also find that African American, Latino, males, female, everybody across the board, we see improvements in the completion of the transferable core and transfer level math course. However, we also see that the equity gaps continue to persist, and in some cases they've gotten wider, especially if you look at the African American and Asian American students, as well as the male and female students. When we looked at what's going on in compression at the lower levels, we actually found no significant difference on whether you start in the traditional math sequence versus a compressed arithmetic or pre-algebra sequence. Of 100 students that started in the compressed arithmetic pre-algebra sequence, we only find that about 5 students eventually complete their transfer level math course. So that means we're losing, that's within 3 years. So we lose 95 of those students who started at these lowest math levels. We also find no impact in longer term or earning a certificate, degree, or transfer. So at this point, it's important to bring up a discussion about equity, the equity implications. We see that both statistics pathway as well as compressed math pathways, especially compressed algebra in particular, are improving outcomes of students across the board. However, there's the equity for it's not doing so for all students on campus. When we spoke with faculty, staff, and administrators to try to better understand what are some of the factors influencing student success or lack thereof. And we wanted to better understand if colleges are aware of these equity gaps and what are they doing. So we found out that when colleges implement some of these reforms, they didn't originally intend to do so with equity in mind. They did it to provide students one more option in terms to have them complete their transfer level math course. Equity, however, has become an important factor, especially partly being driven by the student equity funding, the basic skills transformation grants, where colleges are now more closely looking at their data, disaggregating, and identifying where gaps exist. And when we spoke to colleges, they also shared what are some of the changes that they're making on their campus to try to address this gap. We learned that campuses are starting to integrate student supports into these pathways, for example, by embedding counselors and by embedding tutors. They're also providing faculty professional development, especially to address any biases that may be existing in the curriculum or in the assessments that they give. And also, given that the assessment and placement policies are likely a big factor as to kind of the disproportionate impact of students ending up in remediation, colleges have also begun to reform the assessment and placement policies by the inclusion of multiple measures and other factors. So our research led us to a series of policy recommendations. The first is to expand access to compressed algebra pathways and statistics pathways. This would mean that for students who only need statistics as part of their program of study, that they should be encouraged to participate in a statistics pathway. For students that require a pre-calculus or an algebra-based pathway, they should be offered and encouraged to participate in a compressed algebra pathway. And as the panel will likely discuss, they'll have to lead to discussions of how to scale some of these reforms. Some of the colleges we spoke to noted that some of the barriers to scaling reform at the moment were associated with recruiting faculty, as well as articulation issues with the four-year colleges, but over the summer that changed, so hopefully that will also open the door. And also changing and strengthening assessment and placement processes, because through that process it's that students figure out what is the best math for their program of study. We also recommend that colleges offering compressed algebra consider some of the curricular changes that were made, pedagogical changes that were made in statistics pathways. They may strengthen some of the findings that we're seeing. This included the incorporation of group and activity-based learning, as well as the incorporation of non-academic factors, such as teaching students about grit and the growth mindset. We also, given the poor findings we're seeing for compression at the lowest levels, and just the fact that it doesn't show any difference from the traditional sequence, we actually recommend that colleges consider eliminating the lowest levels of developmental math. After 3 years, the 95% of the students are actually no longer not completing the transfer math outcome. And some colleges that we spoke to are actually moving in this direction. They're either moving the students and providing them support in higher levels of math, or moving the lower level offerings into the non-credit side. And this was partly in response to kind of the results that they're seeing, the equity implications associated with placing students in the lowest levels, and how students from underrepresented groups are more likely to go into those levels. We also recommend that as colleges move to implement reforms and guided pathways, that they integrate their developmental education reforms into these discussions. This is promising because the guided pathways reforms aims to provide more support and structure throughout the college experience. And if we hope to see some of these early impacts persist over the longer term, they're going to need that structure and support throughout. We also recommend that colleges continue to encourage and monitor, encourage innovations and monitor their impact, especially as we saw from our research, not just monitor the overall impact of the new interventions, but also assess the equity of all of these interventions, and reforms that are found to be improving student outcomes for all students should be scaled, and those that are not should be revised or replaced. And so this concludes our presentation. I'd be happy to answer a couple of clarifying questions. And just remind everyone that after the panel, there's another opportunity to ask questions about the research and the panel discussion. So, any questions? So we'll just wait for the microphone to come over.
Hi, I was wondering how or if you were able to deal with differences between students who were enrolled versus were not enrolled, the selection bias issue, whether it's, and I don't know whether it's at different colleges or those colleges they're different, or, yeah.
Yes, so we found that the students enrolling in the algebra pathways compared to our traditional pathways and our statistics pathways were very similar. Similar with our traditional algebra and compressed algebra, they were similar across the board. And the reforms are typically also spread across the state. So we didn't have any indications that the better colleges were deciding to implement some of these reforms. And we also controlled for a variety of student characteristics, college characteristics, and course characteristics. In particular, we found when we're doing our analyses or our early work, we found that there's actually a significant number of statistics courses that are offered outside of the math department, so we included a control for the department in which they were offered, for example, because that may impact some outcomes. One more question.
Were you able to track part-time students versus full-time students in this study?
We do have indicators. We control for whether a student is a part-time, full-time.
And did you see any difference in the results?
So we didn't disaggregate by part-time, full-time, but that would be like one thing that we could check. So we only, when we looked at subgroups, we only looked by race, ethnicity, gender, and low-income status, but that's an important one too. Thank you. So now I'd like to invite our panelists, Myra Snell, Laura Metune, and Nikki Edgecombe, and our moderator, Hans Johnson.
Thanks so much for being here. My name is Hans Johnson. I'm director of the Higher Education Center at the Public Policy Institute of California. And I'm so pleased to have such an expert panel that have both complementary skills and in some cases similar skills and talent and experience. So on my immediate right is Nikki Edgecombe. She is a national expert on community college. She is at the Community College Research Center at Columbia University. And next to her is Laura Metune, who is a vice chancellor at the California Community College's Chancellor's Office. Prior to that, she worked in the legislature, so now she has the pleasure of implementing reforms that she enacted in legislation when she was in the legislature. And next to her is Myra Snell, who is a co-founder of the California Acceleration Project, which has been working on the ground, doing both research and implementing reforms in developmental education in English, and Myra's specialty is in math. So I'm really excited, so I'm going to turn this over to the panel real quickly. I'm going to guide the discussion. First of all, we're going to talk about developmental education reforms in math, and then we'll talk about more broadly other kinds of reforms in developmental education. And remember, when we say developmental education, we mean also remedial education or basic skills. These are interchangeable terms. And then finally, we'll turn it over to the audience for questions. So first, I'd like each of you just to very briefly give us a little bit more of your own background with respect to reforms in developmental education, in math in particular. And we'll start with Nikki. And I know you could go on for a long time, but we're going to get to more detail later. But if you could just give the audience a sense of how you've worked in this area.
Thank you, Hans. It's great to be with you guys today. At the Community College Research Center, we have a portfolio of work that focuses on the developmental education remediation space that also is inclusive of assessment and placement, which I hope will come up as an important element in this discussion today. The way I would frame it, we have a long history of doing evaluations. They started as institutional level evaluations of particular reforms. Many of those reforms have gained traction over the years and have been adopted at the state level or by networks, and we've evaluated those at a larger scale. We've tried to understand what's involved when something moves from the institution level to a state or a network of colleges. We've paid a lot of attention in recent years to what I would describe kind of the DevEd 2.0, which is a step past the innovation, and I don't want to suggest that that innovation doesn't need to continue, but to dig more deeply into issues of implementation, scaling, and rigorous evaluation of impact. So one of the things that always handcuffed us when we did institutional evaluations is oftentimes those sample sizes were relatively small. So there was a limit to what we could infer from that work. But with a lot of the large initiatives happening around the country and here in California as well, we're in a position to do that better.
I'm Laura Metune, and I joined the Community College Chancellor's office this past December. I came on board and joined the team because I had worked with Chancellor Oakley in my role with the legislature for many years, and I believed in his leadership and the opportunity that we have in our community colleges to really change for the better the outcomes for our students. The way our work intersects with math pathways, many of you have probably seen our Vision for Success document. This document outlines a number of ambitious goals that have been supported by our Board of Governors, including increasing the number of students that successfully transferred to UC and CSU by 35%, and increasing the number of students who successfully obtain a certificate or in-demand credential by 20%. And we know that developmental pathways are the roadblocks for many of our students. In fact, just last week, the RP group issued a report through the Transfer Gate that found that about 300,000 community college students were at or near meeting transfer requirements and failed to make it to our UC and CSU partners. Of the just under 160,000 of those had failed to, just 160,000 were very near meeting transfer requirements, and 92% of those hadn't yet completed their transfer math requirement. So we really believe that improving our math strategies and our math remediation strategies will help more of our students get to their goals. When my work in the legislature was surrounding how we invest our funding and our priorities and our statutory structures to support the work of the Chancellor's office and the work of our colleges. And historically, we've taken sort of this perspective that colleges should all have the opportunity to see what works best on their campus. And what we realized through research and reports like this is that not all of these reforms are equal. And maybe we need to redirect our priorities and our funding to support those pathways that have the best chance of improving outcomes for our students.
So my name is Myra Snell, and I have been teaching mathematics at Los Medanos College for 25 years. And in 2010, I co-founded the California Acceleration Project with Katie Hearn, and I run the math side of that work. We are primarily professional development organization, and our goal has been to address the low completion rates of transfer level math and English for students who are placed into remediation, and to close equity gaps relative to that early milestone to transfer preparedness. We primarily have worked prior to recent legislation in a very grassroots way, trying to make the case to faculty for change, embedding that conversation within their local data, broken out by ethnicity, talking with them about not only pedagogical changes, but structural changes that need to be made in the way that remediation is structured and the ways that we are making placement decisions, which are a very high stakes decision about whether or not a student gets placed into developmental education. I'm going to highlight a few of our publications that are here on the side table. We also have a website, theaccelerationproject.org. But the three publications I brought today, Capacity Unleashed is a look at the first group of colleges that started these statistics pathways. And what's interesting, I think, about this work relative to the findings of PPIC is that in those first 8 colleges, we actually completely closed the equity gap for African American students. And here we see it resurfacing. So beginning to wonder, what is the role of professional development and classroom-based interventions after you change structures and placement? Next one is Up to the Challenge. This is a look at something that was not discussed yet in the PPIC study, but I think will be a focus of a future study, which is around co-requisite remediation. So instead of students doing standalone dev ed, they're placed directly into transfer level work with support at that level. And then the last one, and if you haven't heard about Cuyamaca's transformation in mathematics, they were a college that we've been working with since 2011, and they have completely done away with traditional developmental education in mathematics. The vast majority of students are now placed directly into transfer level work with support, and their completion of transfer level math for students who were labeled underprepared jumped from 10% to 67% in 1 year. Mm-hmm. So I think we're beginning to see that not only in what's discussed in this report, but we do have new innovations in the field that have taken place in other states that are showing greater promise even than what we see in the statistics pathways as reported in this particular report.
Great. And so we do want to talk about those, but first I do want to focus a little bit about Dev Ed reforms in math and the reforms that we saw here highlighted. And in particular, I think we'll start in the opposite direction, Myra, starting with you. We saw this remarkable improvement in outcomes for students who take especially the statistics pathway, less so for the higher level of compression. Why are those courses not being offered more frequently? We have some examples of colleges that have engaged in transformation more than others. And so what works, what doesn't, in terms of getting colleges to move on this in this area? And so Myra's going to give us the perspective of someone who's working with the colleges. Laura, you're going to tell us, well, I don't know if you could put on your old hat, what the legislature needs to do, so you could talk about it from the Chancellor's office. And Nikki, I think, could talk about it from what's happening in other states and examples of how that can work. Scaling.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is we want to have a short discussion around sort of obstacles to scaling, like why things haven't taken off at a faster rate.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. So as of now, the California Acceleration Project is working with 45 of the 114 community colleges in mathematics reform. And the main thing that we push are math pathways aligned with students' programs of study. So instead of having the traditional everyone gets forced through intermediate algebra and the vast majority are placed below that level and most don't make it, we start talking about the bifurcation that you see at the transfer level where students have choice in mathematics courses that are taken for their program of study, and we start talking about how to better align the support with the courses they're actually going to take for transfer credit. That just seems so logical, right? But to math faculty, this bumps up against a very deep-held belief system that algebra, in particular intermediate algebra, is sort of a foundation of the laws of nature, of critical thinking, of, I don't know, moral aptitude. So I think that we really do have a belief system around algebra, and most of the math faculty in the state are not trained in statistics. So their minimum qualifications are in pure mathematics or applied mathematics. And I was at UC Berkeley in pure mathematics. The statisticians were in another building on the other side of campus, and we did not really view them as mathematicians. So I think you have all of that kind of value stuff that gets in the way of them rethinking what might be best for students. And then the other one I was going to mention, Olga mentioned earlier, was that we have had, the California Acceleration Project has been working for years on trying to get our transfer partners to be more open to letting the community colleges decide what pre-transfer level support should look like in mathematics. And we just recently, with a series of executive orders from the CSU this summer, that has now been solved for students who need statistics for their program of study if they are using the statistics course to count for quantitative reasoning requirements. So I think that's going to address a lot of the concerns that we used to hear from math faculty, which is we're worried that the local CSU will not take our statistics course for transfer credit if we mess around with how we are placing and prepping students for that course. So I think those are, to me, sort of the two biggies.
So Laura, at the Chancellor's office now, you have some colleges that are reform-minded, others that might not be as reform-minded. You have other systems, the California State University system that you work with as well, in math pathways, for example, in the statistics pathway. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you move the needle, maybe with those who aren't so interested in reform and with the other systems.
I think one of the areas where we've had success in moving the needle is through providing additional funding to colleges to do the hard work that it takes to make these changes across the campus. And just putting my legislative hat back on for a minute, I thought I would just tell a story about the Basic Skills Transformation Grant Program. In 2015-16, I worked in the legislature and we worked on a bill that created a program to provide one-time funding to colleges who were interested in doing work around 6 proven basic skills strategies. That was funded in the budget the following year at about $60 million. And we identified, I think it was 64 initial colleges that were eligible to receive the funding. But in implementing that through the Chancellor's office, the statute outlined some specific strategies, and we added another category of other, anything else that might also improve basic skills outcomes, which resulted in 254 distinct interventions among the colleges, which is wonderful if what you're trying to do is identify which work and which don't, and you want to put a little bit of money everywhere. But what we needed to do is invest in those strategies that had the best chance of improving outcomes for our students. So one thing our board has asked for in this year's budget allocation is to do another round of innovation awards of basic skills transformation grants focused on those practices that really do result in the best outcomes for our students. We've seen a lot of evidence on the co-requisite remediation model, and I think the report from PPIC gives us some direction on where to invest and where not to.
Great. And then, Nikki, I know we talked about the statistics pathway results are encouraging, but there's some concerns in terms of students who want to go into STEM majors or majors that require a traditional math pathway being shut out if they end up in the statistics pathway. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about scaling issues in general, but some of the pros and cons of thinking about maybe other pathways that allow students to pursue technical majors that require more math, and maybe some examples from what other states have done.
Sure. So I like to approach the scaling conversation from 2 dimensions. So within a state like California, you may be looking for 114 community colleges to reform, to figure out new approaches to developmental math or English if those haven't been working for their students. So that's kind of the breadth of scale across institutions. We want to engage a large number of institutions. And why does that matter? Because when you're out there making change, it's nice to know that you can go up or down a highway and maybe see another institution working on this, engage or connect with their faculty. You may have the same transfer institutions that you're serving and the like. So that wider scale issue, I think, is an important one to keep in mind. The other question, I think, that is a challenge as well and reflected in the PPIC work as well is depth of scaling within an institution. And so if we know that a statistics pathway, students who are completing a statistics pathway are completing their transfer level math at a significantly higher rate, but we hold on to the old system as well, it's pretty safe to say we're probably doing a lot of students a disservice. And there's a lot of institutional and cultural reasons why we tend to hold on to those things. In education generally, we don't like to foreclose options. We just add, like that's the solution. I'll just add an additional alternative. But to be honest, there are a lot of bad ideas out there. And so we need to have the moral courage to identify what those are and fashion solutions for students. So in contexts where we've worked, like North Carolina, Virginia, those reforms were dictated by system level mandate. And there's an important role that policy can play in providing both the carrot and the stick that's necessary to encourage action on the part of institutions. Now, one of the things that we learned from that work, and I would argue those systems agree, is that you can't simply ask institutions to change without providing the necessary resources and supports they need to do so. One reason why some of the mandated change can work is if it reflects an alternative that addresses the entire student body. So in other words, why institutions may take a statistics pathway and embrace it but keep it small scale is because they haven't figured out what to do with students that don't require transfer level statistics for their major. And so they may hold on to these different approaches. So if you position the statistics pathway within the broader math pathways reform movement, which essentially seeks to create relatively robust pathways for pretty much all of the program of study alternatives, then that provides an institution a full range of options. They can't come back with the excuse, but what about our X students or what about our Y students? So I feel like one important implementation consideration as it relates to depth of scale is ensuring that we have a full enough body of better ideas and better solutions so that every student who has the ability to benefit from them has a place to go.
Awesome. So that's a good segue into the next section of our conversation, which is not just about developmental education reform in math, but more broadly, reform in the community colleges, maybe still focusing on developmental education, but other kinds of reforms. And I'm going to ask each one of you to identify one reform that you're particularly excited or interested in. And don't repeat what someone else said. So if you go last, and so
I know, right?
You have to go last. Myra. So it's Myra's turn to go first, and then Myra. Sorry, Myra. But you know of so many good reforms. I'm sure you're going to be able to add something at the end. So talk about other reforms that are going on and what you're really hopeful about, and describe the reform for our audience and why you're hopeful about it.
I'm going to encompass everybody's reform and my reform.
Oh, no.
I'm going to go with the guided pathways.
You have to go last then.
Guided pathways. So this year in the budget, the legislature and the governor appropriated $150 million in one-time dollars to support the establishment of the guided pathways framework operating throughout our colleges. So essentially, this is a framework that that's based on research by, among others, the Community College Research Council. Center. So close. That identifies these 4 pillars that we need to focus on to get students successfully from their beginning point to their end point. And under each of these 4 pillars really falls every single reform that can happen on a campus to help students succeed. Assessment and placement, better pathways through remediation, better clear academic maps so that students know what they need to take in order to get to their goal, whether that be transfer or a certificate. And then a clear process for ensuring that our teaching strategies are working and that students are learning and that they're aligning with their career goals. So I think that the Guided Pathways framework shows the most promise, a research-based promise to support improving outcomes for our students.
Is the idea that students have too many choices now, or that they're just not well informed, or there aren't enough counselors?
I think all of those things are true.
Yes.
I knew that answer.
Yes, all of the above. Yeah, one of the first things I did when I took this job was go to a Guided Pathways event that the IEPI in our team was sponsoring, and they had each of these college teams bring a copy of their catalog and their course listing. Yeah. And they had to go through, the faculty members and administrators all had to go through and figure out what classes they needed to take to get to their goal. And you had these professionals who had advanced degrees who had a really difficult time navigating that course catalog to figure out what was necessary. And I thought that was really illustrative of what challenges our students are facing.
So we had Elizabeth Flores, who's over here joining us today, and our staff, especially Bonnie, who's been going through, and actually the rest of us, going through course catalogs to try to identify reforms, looking at English pathways now. And, we all have PhDs or are on the path to it. And we found it difficult to identify, if I was a student coming to this college, how would I figure out what I needed to do? So that's interesting to hear about. Nikki, there was a lot put in Laura's answer, so maybe you could pick out one thing if you wanted to focus on it or something else.
So I'll pull out a frame that is not really the area that I focus on, but I think the empirical evidence is indisputable, and that relates to the City University of New York's ASAP program. You guys are probably familiar with it, and what it really, ASAP is fundamentally it's an accelerated program designed to encourage on-time graduation, but they have students actually pledge to try to graduate, community college students to graduate within 3 years. And I think one of the first round of evaluation essentially showed that students who enrolled in ASAP graduated at roughly twice the rate than non-ASAP students. And in the CUNY system, that's the difference between kind of 20% and 40%. And in the world of education research, that is a ginormous effect size. I mean, there's nothing even a close second in terms of impact and completion. And so I think it's important to think about the pillars of ASAP and how they can be applied within the broader guided pathways conversations. And that is personal support, academic support, and financial support. Essentially, what the ASAP program does is it uses those varying supports to keep students enrolled and continuously enrolled. So they are enrolling during the summer. If there's intersessions, they are enrolling during intersessions. And all of that is designed to keep students on track towards an on-time or 150% time graduation. They made no changes to course structures or pedagogy or curriculum. Now that's where I usually live, so I'm all excited about the opportunities associated with the classroom and serving students in the classroom, but I think it's critical to recognize the power of deploying those supports in ways that keep students enrolled. So that would be my piece I'd add.
Fantastic, thanks. Myra, I'm not going to suggest one for you, except to note that 80% of students are placed in remedial or developmental education right now.
So I wanted, before we go there,
Okay.
Did you want to just say a few words about Gutman?
Right, so there's models out there that attempt to sort of marry some of the guided pathways work along with some of this broader support. Gutman Community College is the newest community college that's part of the City University of New York system. It's now 5 years old, but we feel like it's new. But one of their, among their various approaches is they do not have standalone remediation. Their intent is that students enter as a full-time cohort in the fall. So for your first year, you are with a cohort. There are only 5 programs of study. And students take courses together with their cohort around those 5 programs of study. If you tested into remediation, and CUNY has both an entry and an exit test associated with remediation, you are provided support through a model of broader academic support that is provided to all students. There's a lot of other features of the college that are, drastically different than the way we typically think about colleges or community colleges. And, thus far, they're relatively young, obviously, and they're serving a relatively small number of students, but they have certainly seen much better success than their sister community colleges within the CUNY system. And so a lot of this work was kind of built off of some of the hypotheses associated with the guided pathways model.
And can people find out more information on your website or by looking at Gutman? Or
they've been sort of reticent around having a lot of evaluation in their early years, even though now they're ready to burst with pride. But we were like, you should have told us 3 years ago. We would have had evidence, external evidence to support that. There is a mix of presentations and information available on Gutman's actual website, so lots of ways to see how they organize courses and classes and the like. And there's a spattering of small commentary and short empirical work that's been done, short-term empirical work that's been done by a variety of organizations. I hope that in the next year or two, we'll end up with a lot more information about
Great, thanks.
Okay, so to pick up on the ball that you pitched me, if I had to pick the one high leverage strategy that I think colleges have to address, it's placement. Yeah. And right now, prior to AB 705, we have been placing about 80% of our students into developmental courses in math, English, and or ESL. And as Olga presented, very few of them get out. But what we also understand is that we are using primarily placement testing to make these decisions about who should be placed into developmental education and who should not. And there's now a very robust literature on the fact that these placement tests lack predictive validity. They do not do a good job of determining who will and will not do well in college level coursework. In addition, we have some studies statewide, like Greg Stoop, who's currently president of the RP group, did a study of the district that I'm in, the 3 colleges there, where he was trying to identify what explains the equity gaps we see at the end of the pipeline, transfer preparedness, degree completion, certificate completion, and where does it occur, right? Is it 30 units in? Is it 60 units in? Where is it? And what he found is that 50 to 60% of the inequity that we see in those long-term measures is explained by initial placement. Okay, so what we understand now is that placement is not only a driver for low completion rates in math and English, but it is also a driver of the inequity that we see. So for me, I think when we first started with the California Acceleration Project, we did not understand this, and we worked primarily on pathways and accelerated pathways in DevEd. But once we started questioning, how are we making the decision of who should be, right, in these developmental classes and who should not, and why is it that students of color are, 3 times more likely to be placed into the lower levels of DevEd, that it's that decision that is high leverage. So we see colleges now in the state of California, like College of the Canyons, who changed their placement rules for access into statistics. 15% of their students were eligible prior, over 70% were eligible after. They made no other changes, and they saw no dip in course success rates. So I think what we're seeing, and what the research actually, Judith Scott Clayton and a lot of those seminal pieces in placement research showed that underplacement is the main error that you see in placement is underplacement, and that's invisible to us because those are the students who are sitting in my remedial algebra class doing well, and those are the students that I'm taking credit for as, I'm a good teacher, we got it going on in this class, everybody's doing well, and in fact they probably should not have been there to begin with, right? But underplacement error is invisible to us and it's rampant. So for me, placement reform is the big piece.
Thanks.
Can I just amplify one point that Myra made about this? So don't blame the tests. Blame the people. Blame us, right? We made decisions about how those tests are used. We set and determined cut scores. We set those determinations and they have significant impacts on students. And so I always want to say you can blame AccuPlacer, you can blame Compass, you can blame any standardized test that you may use. But the fact of the matter is we're in this pickle because we made collective decisions to use these systems for legitimate reasons. But now that we know they don't work, we really need to aggressively figure out better ways to do this.
Thanks. And so, Laura, before we turn to audience questions, I'm going to ask you one last question, which is about equity. So we've had an equity theme running through our discussion today. The Chancellor's office has issued their new Vision for Success. We know that California community colleges fully reflect the diversity of our high school graduates in California, the most diverse state in the country. And I'm wondering if you could talk about how the Vision for Success took into account thinking about equity gaps and what your goals are?
Absolutely. So I didn't mention all of the goals of the vision earlier. There are 6 of them, but the last 2 revolve around simply not standing for any sort of gaps in our system, that we have to eliminate equity gaps in terms of race and ethnicity, but also in terms of regions of this state. We've heard some feedback as the Chancellor's office that, how will you do this? You've set a goal that we're never going to achieve. And that's really disheartening to hear, that we think it's acceptable to accept some form of gap in these areas. So certainly we've established this goal. It's something that's going to invade every aspect of our work. And yeah, hope that answers your question.
That's great, thanks. Okay, so now we're going to turn it to the audience. Please wait for a mic, because we are webcasting, and people who are watching online can't hear you unless you have a mic. So we have Pam Birdman over here. And if you could say your name and your affiliation, that would be great.
Sure. My name is Pam Birdman, and I'm with the Opportunity Institute. I wanted to actually pick up on the question Myra highlighted earlier, which is that the research was very promising in terms of improving students' progression through these pathways, but not as promising in terms of reducing equity gaps. And yet some earlier research of some of Myra's work, the California Acceleration Project, had looked better in terms of closing those equity gaps. So I'm just curious if you could talk about, were these studies asking different questions about equity? Were they addressing the same question? And if so, what might explain the differences?
Did you want me to? I mean, that's for
anyone
Hans.
who wants to take a stab.
I think both studies did statistical controls, and I think the controls were similar. I think in the study that we had commissioned early on, there were a wider range of controls. So to me, the studies were quasi-experimental in that respect. I think that it might be, I'm hypothesizing completely here, but that it is a issue with scaling. That once you start with only 8 colleges doing something who've been through an intensive, professional development program and who are very excited about the cutting edge work that they're doing, I think that that produces and influences outcomes. And now when we spread it out wider, we don't see the same impact. So I don't know what that is. I mean, is it professional development? Is it actually, those colleges did intensive curricular reform. They were doing the things Olga mentioned, because I'm sure you interviewed a lot of them, activity-based learning, the integration of what we call in the California Acceleration Project, the affective domain. So really trying to pay attention and set up metacognitive routines in the classroom with students, paying attention to academic growth mindset, having them read articles on why struggling while you're learning is important, the ideas of productive persistence. So all of that was part of their training, and I think integrated meaningfully into the classrooms that they designed. And now that we have a large group of colleges just designing their own pathways, perhaps those elements are not there. But all of that's just hypothesizing, right? I don't.
Yeah, and so just from our standpoint, we looked at 45 colleges, so we looked across the entire system. So we had a different set of colleges, and then I think a lot of the comments Myra makes are very relevant. And part of it might have to do then with how do you scale, and not just scale, but how do you scale so that equity remains a primary consideration and is a focus of outcomes for all students. I should also note that at least by some measures, we found very similar results, like the share of students who do better by ethnicity or income status is about threefold in each one of our assessments. So there are some similar findings there too, especially in the statistics pathway, which has the really robust findings.
One thing to also just to note around those types of analyses is our work suggests they can vary by outcome you measure. So within the same institution, you may be measuring transfer level math, gatekeeper math completion. That racial gap difference may look wholly different for short-term persistence. It may look wholly different for another set of outcomes. So as institutions and systems think about how they want to make sure they have a sense of what's going on, it's important that they look across outcomes. Even within the same institutions, we have seen significant variation, and sometimes trends can completely flip, just by virtue of the outcome you're looking at.
I wonder, Hans, if I could just say one other thing that I'm sure everyone is tracking here, but whenever you're talking about equity gap, it's also important to look at just overall achievement. So in all of those, graphs that Olga presented, students of color are doing markedly better with these reforms, particularly statistics pathways. So we're seeing all boats rise. It's just we're seeing the differential between benefit to white students over students of color, right? Exaggerated. So I think that's important, that when you're talking about equity gaps, you want to talk about both metrics, right? Like, are all boats rising? You need to see that first, and then you need to start thinking about why do some boats rise a little more than others, right? Yeah.
Other questions?
So you guys said that you looked at 45 colleges, so I was wondering, were they rural and urban, or like what was your sample made of?
So the colleges chose themselves in the sense that they were the colleges that were offering alternative pathways in math and statistics. And they were a range of colleges throughout the state, both urban and rural. In the technical appendix, we have a table that shows the characteristics of the students who were in our reform programs versus those who were in traditional programs. They look very similar along a number of characteristics. And sorry, the technical appendix is only available online. So if you go there, you'll see. And then in the models, we actually include what's called college fixed effects. So we're trying to, when we do that, we're trying to control for, is it just the case that colleges that tend to be better at everything are the ones that offered these reforms, and the ones that are worse at everything did not? And the results didn't change very much when we control for college. And in fact, in the report itself, we have two comparison lines. One's just a descriptive line that shows you the difference between the student outcomes in the traditional versus the reform pathway. And the other one is our regression controlled line, and they're not very different in any of the assessments we looked at. And the reason they're not very different is because the students and the colleges are pretty similar in the two sets. Now, there are things we can't control for, and we need to be very careful about that. So most importantly, we cannot control for high school background because our state lacks a longitudinal student database, which we are all hoping will be fixed soon in California and will make our lives so much better. And other states have found a way to solve that problem. And I'm hoping California will. But that's one example of one of the deficiencies of what we have. And then Myra kind of alluded this to earlier. Some of the first actors might be those who are most excited and taking ownership over the program. And then as it spreads, the challenge is and you've spread the intervention, so talk about that a little bit, maybe.
Well, for example, right now we have a project going on in the Central Valley in collaboration being led by the Dana Center, Uri Treisman's house, that is working with all of the 14 community colleges in the Central Valley and the 3 CSUs and the 1 UC. And it's a math task force that is really going to attempt to, they're just having their first meeting actually in 2 weeks, so I'll be down there. But I think the goal is for them to come out with a set of recommendations around seamless math pathways for students starting, and they're going to look at placement reform, of course, because I will be there hammering that. But, to really look at starting students off in transfer level with concurrent support and clear math pathways and bridges across math pathways if students change their mind. But taking a regional approach, I think in some of these areas where you have smaller colleges and very isolated, geographically isolated, that taking that regional approach I think is going to embolden them, right, to step out. So that to me, in my mind, is sort of a pilot. Like I'm very curious to see how that work what it produces. And if it goes well and seems to produce robust pathways in mathematics, then I think we might look at doing that elsewhere in the state. You know, we've got a lot of rural areas in the northern part of the state too. So anyway, that's what I have to offer in terms of rural colleges.
Nikki, in terms of implementation issues and having faculty and deans, department heads take ownership over an innovation, what's been your experience when you're out in the field talking to community colleges, not just in California, but in other states?
Well, so I would say no one likes to be told what to do. Even if you know you have a problem, no one likes to be told what to do. So the most effective strategies have done their best to engage as broad a set of stakeholders as possible in this level, in both kind of big picture system level conversations, and then to roll that a similar model out within the institution. So to not simply involve math faculty in deciding about statistics pathways, but to involve advisors and math faculty and academic support folks in our physical sciences and other disciplines that have strong feelings about the use of math within their programs of study. So when that's happened, that has facilitated what I would describe as that depth of scaling, you know, within the institution, making the wholesale changes and the different, understanding what different institutional functions are affected by this kind of change. But importantly, what that also does is it lays the groundwork in the norms of collaborating with people outside of your normal world to facilitate other change. I think one of the important elements that came out of CCRC's Dev Ed work and is one of the guiding principles of guided pathways is that these discrete interventions in various parts of the institution are not robust or sustained enough to generate significantly higher completion rates. They may be kind of statistically significant in my world, but most policymakers would not be satisfied with what they're seeing. So an important element is to lay that groundwork within institutions, and even that model, the regional model, that's a similar idea of laying the groundwork to support innovation and change across institutions and in partnership with our four-year.
I should mention, too, that the Central Valley work is really being spearheaded by the Central Valley Higher Ed Consortium, which is an amazing regional collaborative of the CEOs, college CEOs in that region, and it's the executive director is Ben Duran, and he deserves a lot of credit, I think, for the leadership that he has shown in the Central Valley.
And we had Ben on an earlier panel discussion here of some earlier PPIC work. So we have a question up here. Yes.
I have to ask something. So how will they implement?
Introduce yourself for those of us who don't know.
Okay. Hi, I'm Elizabeth Flores. I worked with PPIC over the summer as a Richard Riordan summer intern. So I had the opportunity.
Like course catalog after course catalog after course catalog.
Yes, it's endless, and like, you know, like Hans said, it actually was really confusing. I had to draw it out in order to understand it, and then figure out, okay, what leads to what, which way do I go, and anywho, it's real. The struggle's real. So my question for you all is, how, thinking about assessment, how will the implementation of the new Common Assessment Initiative, I know it's pending, but how will that impact math developmental education?
Yeah, I think I would answer that by saying that I worked in the Assembly Higher Education Committee at the time that legislation created the Common Assessment Initiative. And that bill grew out of, among other things, a report that came out of the Legislative Analyst's Office that talked about these challenges that we face in assessment, that colleges have cutoff scores that run the gamut, that test scores aren't portable between colleges, but it didn't raise this question about the validity of tests. So from that came this effort to try and streamline assessment among our colleges. Can we leverage our purchasing power if we have a common test that we're using? And so the legislature enacted this legislation that required the creation of a common assessment. What we've learned in the 4 years since that legislation was put into effect is that testing isn't the best way for us to determine whether or not students are prepared, as was explained by my colleagues here. So the Chancellor's office, maybe a year ago, realized that the direction of establishing a common assessment isn't probably the best way to make sure our students are being properly assessed. Things that we've done in the meantime is invest in the multiple measures assessment pilot, which works with CalPass Plus to access students' high school performance data and use that to better place students. And then just this year, really to push us over the finish line in the right direction, the legislature enacted and the governor signed AB 705 to require that colleges use high school performance in the placement of students and really limit the ability of colleges to place students in remedial courses that aren't required. So between what we know now in terms of research, as well as where the legislature has pointed us to go, I think what we'll see across our system is a better method of placement that will leverage data sharing so that we can access high school information, and the use of multiple measures that rely more heavily on those measures that we know are better predictors of students' success.
So I have a question, and it's self-serving, because it leads into PPIC's next study, which was with CalPass Plus data, where we're looking at the pathway through high school and into college. And one thing we hear when we talk to colleges a lot is, well, they're not prepared when they graduate from high school, even if they took algebra in high school, or algebra 2, even up to algebra 2, they're not prepared. And so I'm wondering what your reflections are, any of you could take this, on that connection between high school learning and what happens in the community colleges, and how much of the reform needs to incorporate improvements in practices in high schools.
Okay, so where I would start with that is that I have never met a college professor who thought their students were prepared. Right. So I worked with the Harvard Calculus Consortium in the 90s for nearly 10 years on calculus reform nationwide, and there were professors in mathematics at Harvard who did not feel like their students were well prepared. I've never met a calculus instructor who didn't complain about the algebra preparation of their student, and I'm not being facetious here, I'm serious. So I think that this issue of what we think preparedness looks like and what we think our responsibility is in terms of incorporating just-in-time remediation and thinking about the ways that students might have heard about something and now they're having to transfer it into new context, and how much faculty need to think about where the line of ownership, right, for facilitating that learning is. Okay, so that said, I'll also go back to the point of severe underplacement, that I think we are not right now doing a good job of recognizing what students do know and can do, and we have not traditionally had a student capacity-oriented approach to assessment and placement. And that, I think, is going to completely switch with AB 705, because now it is the burden of the colleges to produce placement research to show whether or not students are highly unlikely to succeed in transfer level work. So now, instead of saying to the students coming in, you need to demonstrate you're ready, and only 20% of you make that mark by a test, we're now saying to colleges, you need to provide research that identifies students who are highly unlikely to succeed. So the burden has shifted to the colleges. So I personally, Hans, there's so much variety, obviously variability in high school preparedness, and I don't think anybody would argue that there isn't some problem there. But I think that the community colleges have to own the fact that the problem might be in ourselves and the ways that we are recognizing student capacity, honoring student capacity, building structures where students can succeed, as opposed to pointing the finger downward. And I think a lot of times, too, we talk about poor alignment, and I'm not sold on that either. I think if you look at traditional textbooks that are being used in the algebra sequence, they look pretty much like what's being used at the high schools, and pedagogy at the college level might even be less effective than pedagogy you typically see at the high school level. So I'm not convinced that the main driver is high schools are doing a bad job, or that there's misalignment between what math expectations. I think it lands more solidly in the community college's court. So.
We have a question here.
Hi, Roy Simpson, Summers River College, right down the road, mathematics. So we pilot the MMAP model, kind of on our own in our own rogue way. We didn't ask anybody, we just took the model itself and started piloting it. Our main feeder district is Elk Grove.
So MM is multiple measures.
Pardon me?
MMAP.
MMAP, I'm sorry, multiple measures. And so right down the road is Elk Grove. Elk Grove does not participate in CalPAS. So we had to align their curriculum through somebody tell me, C something, not CID, but how do the high schools do it? What is it? I forget. It's some type of course ID so that we know exactly where it aligns, and then we create our own model. And we'll say from our data and we have a great research department that kind of goes through all the hoops, right? From our data, we are finding that students that place via the MMAP into our DevMath do considerably worse than students who place via our assessment. And then we find that they do on par with the rest of our students if they're placed into transfer level. Now, I will qualify this statement by saying it's a small n right now. Okay.
Yeah.
So, but I'm going to piggyback on something you had said, that placement is actually a major issue. I think a lot of our issues in community college, at least, as far as in mathematics and getting the students through and completion on time, really is revolving around the placement models that we have. And the fact that our hands are tied a bit on funding because a student can only take the assessment. It used to be when I first started teaching, I would think, take it once. You should, if you're serious, take it once. You'll be fine, right? As time has gone on, I realized, no, students from high school come in and they wake up and they think, there's an assessment I have to take today, I'll take it. They don't take it seriously. They do need a second try, so we have it built into our system that 30 days later they can do a second try, but that's it, right? And we don't have a remediation piece in there. So really a proper assessment would have this built-in remediation piece in between where you may hiccup, it could have been several years. You could just completely flub on, I forgot that negative times negative is a positive or some silliness like that. Yeah. And so that remediation piece needs to be built into our assessments if we're going to hold on to the assessment model in combination with MMAP.
Yeah, so I was just going to say that if I understood you correctly, the issue of performance in the Dev Ed class after the implementation of MMAP dropping I have seen that at other colleges, and I think what's happening there is that those classes were padded with students who should not have been there previously. So now we are actually having Dev Ed courses with students who maybe belong there, I don't know, but, and we're not really equipped we haven't figured out how to support them, right? So I think that finding is something I have seen at other colleges. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's sad that students don't enter a test not knowing it's a high stakes test.
Oh my gosh.
Don't do well, and then they have to wait 30 days. Well, 30 days might be into the semester. I mean, it's just, it could be a problem depending on where you are. And in fact, we looked at this in an earlier report. Olga, remind me, we saw some colleges didn't allow retesting for a year.
Yeah.
So, it has been a high stakes test without students fully knowing that it might be a high stakes test. And if they're taking it, many students don't take math in their high school year as senior. There's a senior year of high school. I have language problems, so I would not pass the English one. But so I think those are also issues with why a lot of us aren't big fans of the test and are bigger fans of looking at high school course taking and high school records.
And there's just down the road at the CSUS here, they're implementing an assessment model that actually was somewhat attractive, where the students have a practice assessment they take at their house, it's online, and then they have a 48-hour cool-off period where a remediation course is built on right then through the software, and then they have to schedule a proctored exam They have 6 months to start that. But then they can take that proctored exam up to 4 times, each time with a cool-off period in between of like 2 days, and each time with a remediation course built for them based upon their weaknesses.
Yeah.
And so you see this data of where they place, the second time, the third time is the jump, because they're tired of taking this. They've actually watched the remediation.
I think the other thing that we're sort of skimming over here is that these placement tests are largely algebra-based tests. And so really thinking about the relevance of the skills on which they're being tested and the coursework that they need for their program of study. So I think that's another piece, right, that when we are thinking about math pathways is really, if we're using testing in any way, should it be used disjunctively, like you can get into transfer level with a test score, or by demonstrating, capacity with other multiple measures, and then really thinking about what is the test testing and is that relevant to the courses you're going to be taking. So I think all of those are important issues as we're moving into this new era of assessment and placement.
So thanks. So we have time for just one more question.
Ludmila Shved, Sierra College math faculty. Question for you, Myra, I guess, because you're more in the field, maybe. Do you know of any models or any colleges that have something to help students to be moved from one class where they don't belong to the class they do within the first week or two of the semester? Some process that colleges came up with to make it easy relatively for students to jump the ship and go from class to class where, for example, right now I have a class, I think about 50% of them should be higher. They're bored to death, and they it's very hard to teach such class because students who need my attention take it, and students who don't need, they shouldn't be there because they're stronger. So I would love to have an opportunity when I see these strong students during first week, you can identify them. First 2 weeks, you definitely can identify them if I could put them in the right place right there so that they don't lose a semester. Have you heard of anyone or any college do that, something like that?
Not in a systematic way, and I think because of the logistical difficulties, it's probably not a high leverage approach. So I think if you're experiencing that, it really is that we're starting to see problems with the placement system, right? So there's a few, but they've always been sort of instructors working with counselors to move students, so it's not anything that could really be scaled or be systematic.
So on that note, let me, and please join me in thanking our panel and Olga.